Hello, I'm Desad500, and this is your presidential fact of the day. The 18th President of the United States, Ulysses S. Grant, is a very important and influential figure in American history, not least because he was the first American president to officially designate a national park, Yellowstone National Park. Hello, I'm Desad500, and this is your presidential fact of the day. Back in the mid-19th century, having a facial hair was probably the only way you're going to become president, as not very many presidents and even vice presidents of the time were clean-shaven. However, since 1913, we have not had a president with facial hair. And we hadn't had a vice president with facial hair since 1921, until just this year when J.D. Vance was sworn in. Hello, I'm Desad500, and this is your presidential fact of the day. The 41st President of the United States, George H.W. Bush, was quite an interesting character. He was going to eat with the Japanese Prime Minister. However, he was feeling a little bit nauseous and probably a little bit nervous, so he vomited on the guy's lap. Hello, I'm Desad500, and this is your presidential fact of the day. The 17th President of the United States, Andrew Johnson, was not the most likable president that there's ever been, and that is evident at his own inauguration speech, not as president in 1865, but rather as vice president in 1865, when he showed up to his own inauguration speech completely drunk. He messed up all of his words and was very embarrassing for the new vice president to serve under Lincoln during the Civil War. It was very, very difficult. Hello, I'm Desad500, and this is your presidential fact of the day. The 19th President of the United States, Rutherford B. Hayes, is not well remembered in the United States. In fact, such a crazy election, you'd think everyone would know his name, but nobody in America really knows who Rutherford Hayes was. That's not the same in Paraguay, where everybody loves the 19th president. That's because Rutherford Hayes worked out a land agreement which gave Paraguay almost 90% of their land after a war against Argentina. Hello, I'm Desad500, and this is your presidential fact of the day. The 22nd and the 24th President of the United States, Grover Cleveland, was actually very important even before he became president the first time, because he was part of the New York, the Erie County militia, because he was in Buffalo and did a lot of policing work there. And actually, did a lot of executing. Grover Cleveland executed a lot of people. And when asked to step down, he declined. He didn't want to do it because he wanted to spare other people of the guilt of killing somebody. Hello, I'm Desad500, and this is your presidential fact of the day. The 25th President of the United States, William McKinley, was a devoted family man and absolutely loved his wife, especially for the time of his life from the 1840s to the 1900s. He was very devoted. His wife, Ida, frequently had seizures at dinner parties, but McKinley always covered her up with a rag, so that it could be concealed from the other people there. And he never cheated on his wife, unlike some other presidents. Hello, I'm Desad500, and this is your presidential fact of the day. In a sign of American imperialism to come, the 13th President of the United States, Millard Fillmore, in probably one of the worst things he ever did as president, and that's saying a lot because it's Millard Fillmore, was open a trade deal with Japan. Now, why is that bad? Well, because Japan had been completely isolated from the rest of the world for centuries. And in just 90 years after this trade deal, Japan would declare war on the United States. Hello, I'm Desad500, and this is your presidential fact of the day. The 29th President of the United States, Warren G. Harding, was known to not be exactly the type of person you'd want as president. And I say this because he once gambled in a gambling match as the president, but that's not even all of it. He gambled the whole White House china. there since John Adams. Worst thing is, he lost. So he lost all of the White House china that had been there for over 100 years. Hello, I'm Dazad500, and this is your presidential fact of the day. When the 32nd president of the United States, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, married his wife Eleanor, no last name change was needed. And that's because Eleanor's maiden last name was in fact Roosevelt. Now this is because Franklin and Eleanor were sixth cousins. But you know what? You're gonna love who you're gonna love. Hello, I'm Dazad500, and this is your presidential fact of the day. Yesterday I mentioned that Franklin Roosevelt and his wife Eleanor were sixth cousins. But did I also mention that Franklin Roosevelt, the 32nd president, and Theodore Roosevelt, the 26th, were fifth cousins? And actually, with Eleanor's dad not being in their life very much, Theodore walked Eleanor down the aisle at her wedding. Hello, I'm Dazad500, and this is your presidential fact of the day. The 26th president of the United States, Theodore Roosevelt, is, for good reason, often ranked as one of the best presidents in American history. And while it is true that he did a lot of good for the United States, it's also true that he did quite a bit of bad, because directly caused by Roosevelt was Woodrow Wilson. And that's because in the 1912 election, his buddy, William Howard Taft, was running for re-election. But Roosevelt was more of a progressive, and Taft claimed to be progressive, but really was a conservative. And this made Roosevelt very, very mad. And he decided to run against Taft for the Republican nomination, but he failed. So he ran under the Progressive Party and split the vote between Republicans and progressives that gave Woodrow Wilson a massive lead. And of course, the presidency. However, had Roosevelt not run, assuming all of the progressive voters would vote for William Howard Taft, the only states Wilson would have won were the South, Oklahoma, Kentucky, and Arizona. Hello, I'm Dazad500, and this is your presidential fact of the day. The 11th president of the United States, James K. Polk, was the only president to keep 100% of his campaign promises. And that was getting a ton of land off of Mexico with a bit of blood on his hands, but whatever. Making a deal with the British over the Oregon Territory, reducing the tariff, and creating an independent treasury. Hello, I'm Dazad500, and this is your presidential fact of the day. The 28th president of the United States, Woodrow Wilson, is often described as one of the worst American presidents. And in America, his reputation is very, not that great. But if you go to Central Europe, everyone loves him. And that's because he did a lot in World War I to free the Central Europeans from the Germans. Hello, I'm Dazad500, and this is your presidential fact of the day. The 36th president of the United States, Lyndon Johnson, was quite an interesting president. He would often conduct presidential business on the toilet with the door wide open. He would force journalists into the bathroom with him while he was doing his business to conduct meetings. Hello, I'm Dazad500, and this is your presidential fact of the day. Yesterday, we talked about the 36th president of the United States, Lyndon B. Johnson, and how he would often conduct meetings on the toilet. What I failed to mention is that I might have a reason as to why he loved the bathroom so much. During World War II, Johnson was scheduled to go on a plane and do some missions in the sky or something like that. However, he had to go to the bathroom, right as the plane is taking off. So the plane takes off with a replacement for Lyndon Johnson, and that plane crashes, and everyone on board, unfortunately, passes away, while Johnson goes on a different plane and, of course, survives to become the 36th president of the United States. Hello, I'm Dazad500, and this is your presidential fact of the day. Well, today, the 17th of September, 2025, marks 238 years of the signing of the Constitution, something to do with the passing of the Constitution. And the fourth president, James Madison, was the author of the Constitution. Well, the chief author anyways. It was, of course, revised. However, he would then join the Anti-Federalists, which opposed the ratification of the Constitution. I already made a presidential fact about this, but I'm going to reiterate this because he was one of the most... He was a supporter of the Bill of Rights, which were a set of amendments to go into his Constitution. So one of the biggest questions that I have is that why didn't he already write them into the Constitution if he was going to support them anyways? Hello, I'm Dazad500, and this is your presidential fact of the day. The 19th president of the United States, Rutherford B. Hayes, was elected on some pretty suspicious circumstances. He was elected in 1876 in that 1876 election, obviously. The 1876 election was so crazy, I could probably make a month's worth of facts about it. So that's probably what I'm going to do. I don't want to, scam myself and just put a bunch of different facts in here. But what I am going to say for today is that Rutherford Hayes beat his Democratic opposition, Samuel J. Tilden, by 1 electoral vote. Nothing more. Hello, I'm Dazad500, and this is your presidential fact of the day. I know yesterday I told you that I'd be making a lot of facts about the 1876 election. And I'm still going to do that, but I picked a very bad day to start because today, if I'm doing the math right, 144 years ago, James Garfield, the 20th president, was shot and killed. And only half of that's right. He died today on the 19th of September, 1881, but he was shot all the way back in July. He survived 2 months of intense torture. In fact, the bullet wound wasn't even that big. Had the doctors done nothing, he would have survived. But a 3.5 roughly inch hole grew into a 20-inch hole, and Garfield died of septic shock. Hello, I'm Dazad500, and this is your presidential fact of the day. We're going to be heading back to the 1876 election that I talked about, and last time I said that Rutherford Hayes won the election by 1 electoral vote. However, it goes further than that, because there were actually 20 electoral votes that were up for dispute, and those were the electoral votes from the states of Oregon, South Carolina, Florida, and Louisiana, which were all awarded to Hayes in very weird circumstances. What circumstances? Wait for tomorrow. Hello, I'm Dazad500, and this is your presidential fact of the day. Continuing on where we left off with the 1876 election, is that Rutherford Hayes won by 1 vote because he was awarded electoral votes. And what I mean by that is because the states of Oregon, Louisiana, South Carolina, and Florida all had insanely close margins that a House committee, or a committee in general, not necessarily a House committee, but a committee, had to be convened consisting of 7 Republicans, 7 Democrats, and 1 independent named David Davis to suggest who these electoral votes go to. And of course, the independent was very independent. We don't even know whether this independent guy liked. The Democrats thought he would side with them because the Democrats promised to support his campaign for Congress. However, Davis thought, you know what, this may be a conflict of interest, and excused himself from the committee, being replaced by a Republican. And with 8 Republicans and 7 Democrats, of course, they granted to the Republican. Hello, I'm Dazad500, and this is your presidential fact of the day. Leaving off, we're coming back where we left off from the 1876 election, where Rutherford Hayes has just won the presidency by very weird circumstances. Well, the people who had supported the Democratic candidate, Samuel J. Tilden, were very upset. Very, very upset. And understandably so. Tilden had had 184 electoral votes before midnight. And of course, 185 were needed to win the election. And of course, Tilden didn't get any more after that. But yeah, Tilden supporters were outraged. How outraged? Outraged enough to consider a second civil war. Less than 10 years, or I guess technically over 10 years, since the last one. I don't know what they're talking about. Hello, I'm Dazad500, and this is your presidential fact of the day. Picking off where we left off yesterday with the 1876 election, where Samuel Tilden supporters were so violent, thinking that Tilden had actually legitimately won, to the point where they were thinking about a second civil war. Well, Tilden, of course, wanting the presidency, he kind of ran for it, didn't concede before Hayes was sworn in. Hayes was approved as president on the 2nd of March, 1877, and quietly sworn in the next day on the 3rd, out of fear that someone might, trying to assassinate him. And since the 4th of March, 1877, was a Sunday, and you're not allowed to get sworn in on a Sunday, he was then sworn in on the 5th of March, 1877, with more protection. Tilden didn't concede until the 13th of June, 1877, remarking that he can be happy that he was elected by the people to the most powerful office in the land without having any of the stresses of actually serving that duty. Hello, I'm Dazad500, and this is your presidential fact of the day. The 1876 election, which we've been talking about for quite some time now, was actually the very first election in American history where the winner of the Electoral College actually didn't win the popular vote. Back in 1824, that's a different story, and honestly could probably make a presidential fact about that, so I'm not going to tell you the story. But this is the first election where the winner of the Electoral College, Rutherford Hayes, actually got less votes than his, less popular vote than his opponent, Samuel J. Tilden of the Democrats. Hello, I'm Dazad500, and this is your presidential fact of the day. I know I said I'd make one more fact about the 1876 election, but something big happened yesterday. Yesterday, one of the women involved in shooting, or the attempted shooting, of Gerald Ford died yesterday. She was, I think, 95. And that made me wonder, Gerald Ford was the only president to have an attempted assassination attempt by a woman. Not once, but twice. Hello, I'm Dazad500, and this is your presidential fact of the day. I'm not quite done with the 1876 election, but after today, I will be. Samuel Tilden won the popular vote in the 1876 election. We've already established it, meaning that the president, Rutherford Hayes, actually lost the popular vote. But what I didn't know until I started researching about this crazy election was that Samuel Tilden actually got the most amount of votes that any one person had gotten while also losing the Electoral College at 51% of the popular vote. I think that's pretty interesting. Hello, I'm Dazad500, and this is your presidential fact of the day. Well, maybe not presidential fact of the day, more like first lady fact of the day, because Ulysses S. Grant's wife, Julia Grant, swears to this day that on the night that Lincoln was killed, April 14th, 1865, that John Wilkes Booth himself looked inside her carriage at her children. That's a very scary thought. Hello, I'm Dazad500, and this is your presidential fact of the day. On the 14th of April, 1865, President Abraham Lincoln was shot and would die the next day on the 15th. However, he wasn't the only president targeted during that attack. The then General and future President, Ulysses S. Grant, was actually invited to be with Lincoln at the play where he was shot. However, he was going to go visit relatives out of town, and therefore was not there on the fateful day, and he was in fact the target of John Wilkes Booth. Hello, I'm Dazad500, and this is your presidential fact of the day. The 18th President of the United States, Ulysses S. Grant, was one of, if not the most famous and most influential generals of the American Civil War, being the leader of the Continental Army. However, for such a role, you'd think that, you wouldn't be scared of the sight of blood, but that was General Grant, such a very interesting man. Hello, I'm Dazad500, And this is your presidential fact of the day. Well, today is the 30th of September, and here in Canada, Orange Shirt Day, or Truth and Reconciliation Day. And so while we here in Canada honor and remember what happened to our Indigenous communities, I think it's a good idea to go down south and look at a very important Indigenous person. Vice President of the United States, Charles Curtis, served under the 31st President, Herbert Hoover, as the very first Vice President of color in American history. And that was only not even in the top 10 reasons as to why Herbert Hoover lost the election of 1932. And just like that, for the first time since I started this series, I managed to post one of these every day for the month. See you next month.